In this video, we're going to briefly go over eukaryotic microorganisms. We're going to look at the shapes of some different microorganisms and talk about how they most likely developed through endosymbiosis. Hopefully you remember the diversity of eukaryotic organisms that are out there. They include plants, animals, algae, fungi and yeasts, and the protozoans. Not all of these are microorganisms, but some of them do fall into that category, in particular single-celled algae. Even those that can grow in multicellular units are still considered microorganisms. Many fungi and yeast are microscopic, yeast in particular because they are individual cells. A few animals are considered microorganisms, in particular worms, and some of those do cause human disease. And the protozoans, so things like amoebas and euglenias and other things you may have looked at under a microscope in biology classes. I'm sure you all remember how eukaryotes differ from prokaryotes like bacteria, and one of those biggest differences is the presence of membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles. Bacteria do not have membrane-bound organelles. We're not going to go over the functions of the endoplasmic reticulum or the Golgi or the nucleolus. We will leave that for your cell biology class or your molecular biology classes to talk about how all of those certain things work, because this class focuses primarily on prokaryotes. Like prokaryotes, however, eukaryotes can have a cell wall. They can have flagellum, they can have some sort of vacuoles that they store things in or move things about the cell in. And many eukaryotic cells are photosynthetic and have chloroplasts. And they developed these chloroplasts or obtained these chloroplasts through the process of endosymbiosis. I do want to point out some structures that eukaryotic cells have that are homologous to things in prokaryotes, although in our eukaryotic cells they do act slightly different. The first is that our eukaryotes do have cilia. These are hair-like filaments that are spread all over the cell, like we can see here, all these fine hair-like filaments. These are used for movement of the eukaryotic cells through a liquid of some sort, so through water, through blood, if they happen to infect the body. They're kind of like fimbriae and how fimbriae can be used for movement in a bacterial cell, but they're not used for attachment. The second, also one involved in movement, is the presence of flagella. Bacteria have flagella. A number of eukaryotic cells have flagella, like our euglena, which is what this diagram is showing. And although they carry out the same function, they are structurally different than bacterial flagella, and they also move differently. So their very active motion is different from that of bacteria. Eukaryotic cells have all of those membrane-bound organelles with very specialized functions. And there's been this long-standing idea that membrane-bound organelles like chloroplasts, even mitochondria, developed through a process called endosymbiosis. This process is best described as the engulfment of a prokaryotic cell by a eukaryotic precursor. Thus, in primary endosymbiosis, we begin with some sort of ancestral host cell, so the eukaryotic precursor. This eukaryotic precursor already has a mitochondrion. Those developed before chloroplasts did. And this particular cell is going to engulf a cyanobacterium. These are prokaryotic cells that are photosynthetic. Once this prokaryotic photosynthetic cyanobacteria gets engulfed, it becomes an integral part of our cell, and this cell is now a eukaryotic algae cell. This is how a number of our algae develop, like some of our blue-green algae. That's one form of endosymbiosis, and it's called primary endosymbiosis because we have a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic precursor coming together to form a new type of cell. The new chloroplast, derived from that cyanobacteria, now has a double membrane, just like the organelles that we find in eukaryotic cells. That's not the only way that endosymbiosis has occurred. There's also evidence of a type of symbiosis called secondary endosymbiosis. In this form of endosymbiosis, one eukaryotic cell engulfs another. Here we have our eukaryotic algal cell that probably developed through primary endosymbiosis. And our large cell, again, is that ancestral primitive eukaryotic cell. Has a mitochondrion, has a nucleus, doesn't have any other specialized organelles. This algal cell gets engulfed by our eukaryotic precursor cell, and over time, that algal cell loses its nucleus, loses its mitochondria, and only the chloroplast remains. There's our remaining chloroplast, and in this case, instead of just being double membrane bound like we see in plants, it actually has 4 membranes. This seems really weird, 2 eukaryotic cells coming together, one of them losing a whole bunch of stuff and the other one keeping just a small portion of it. But there is quite a bit of evidence also that this happened in things like dinoflagellates and in some types of protists you might have looked at, like euglena and other euglenoids. Since all eukaryotes have mitochondria and only some have chloroplasts, scientists believe that 2 separate events must have occurred in order to develop eukaryotic cells like plant cells. There are several lines of evidence that support the endosymbiotic theory. The first is that those mitochondria and chloroplasts resemble bacteria in both size and in shape. The arrangement of double membranes around structures like mitochondria and chloroplasts is consistent with the idea that a bacteria was engulfed, and the 2 membranes come from the bacterial membrane and the invagination of the precursor cell membrane. And each of these, mitochondria and chloroplast, have their own DNA, and that DNA sequence is much more similar to bacterial DNA than it is to eukaryotic DNA. Now I want to show you some pictures of some of my favorite eukaryotic organisms. The first is the amoeba. Everyone's seen a picture of an amoeba. They're these funky little alien type cells that can move around. And as they move around, they can form these things called pseudopods, which means false feet. They use these pseudopods to move around their environment and also to engulf large particles for their nutrients. I also really like Tetrahymena. These are covered with cilia that you can see in the picture, all the multiple hairs around them, and they use those cilia to swim around in their environment. And then one that some of you may have heard about, especially those of you who are from Colorado, and that's Giardia. This one actually causes a disease called giardiasis. It's a severe and prolonged diarrheal disease, but Giardia itself is really interesting looking. It has a sort of triangular shaped body here and multiple flagella coming from the body like this. Has 2 there on the bottom, and then it has a couple that come off the end of it. You can't see it very well in this picture, but it also has 2 nuclei that kind of make it look like a face. Up top on this slide, we have a picture of some protozoan called Trichomonas. What I really like about it is that it's neat looking. It has some flagella that you can see on the end right here, but what's interesting about this flagella is that it goes through the membrane. And this causes a sort of ruffle-like appendage on the top. You can see that undulating membrane here on the picture, and that's the flagella that runs all the way through it and then comes out at the end here. On the bottom panel, what we're looking at here are red blood cells. You guys have seen red blood cells before. And these things that you can see here in the blood that are not blood, this is actually a type of protozoan called a trypanosome. You can probably guess by the fact that they're here in a blood smear that they do cause disease. There's 2 main types of trypanosomes that cause human disease. The one we find here in the Americas is called Chagas disease. And in Africa, there's a species of trypanosome that causes a disease called African sleeping sickness. In addition to the protists, fungi and yeast are also eukaryotic cells, and some of them can cause disease in humans or in animals. The bottom panel here is an electron micrograft of a yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. They are eukaryotic, so they are much larger than bacteria. There aren't a lot of true fungi that cause disease, although there are some that can cause infections in the lung. But one of the common diseases caused by yeast is thrush. And this is the outgrowth of a yeast on the mouth, and it forms that white film that you can see on the person's tongue. The absolute strangest fungal infection I've ever heard of is caused by a genus of fungi called the cordyceps fungi. And these fungi infect a variety of insects, and they infect the brain of the insect, and they turn the insect into a little fungal zombie. Once that insect has been infected, they're overtaken, and now the whole focus of the insect is on spreading those fungal spores so that the fungus can infect more insects and spread throughout the forest. Rapid review time. Eukaryotes are a very diverse group. They can include animals, plants, fungi, protists, yeast, and algae. We believe they developed through the process of endosymbiosis. Primary endosymbiosis, where a bacteria is engulfed by a eukaryotic precursor, and secondary endosymbiosis, where two eukaryotic cells combine to become one. They can be motile due to flagella and cilia, and we looked at some pictures and talked briefly about a variety. Amoebas, ciliates, giardia, trichomonas, trypanosomes, yeast, the cordyceps fungi, my favorite zombie fungi. And the thing to remember about particularly the protozoan eukaryotes is that they are generally free living. They do not cause disease. They just want to go about their protozoan life, their eukaryotic life, doing their eukaryotic thing, and they typically only cause disease when they get into our body accidentally. Okay, that's it for now. Even those that can grow in multicellular